Okay, so we have we've talked about some triggered abilities, right? And we've also talked about a lot of effects that you like, things that you can do, casting spells, activating abilities, performing actions. These are proactive things that you do. But what about abilities like triggered abilities that don't really represented by specific actions a player takes? They just sort of happen. Um, so triggered abilities are abilities that are put on the stack automatically when their trigger conditions are met, and they are worded with a very specific structure. So they always have the words when, whenever, or at. Then they'll immediately followed by some specific set of things that would cause this ability to trigger, and then there will also be a line about what happens when that triggered ability resolves. Let's look at an example. So this for here, right? You have whenever, and then its trigger condition: a creature enters under your control. A creature you control enters. The new wording is still tripping me up. And then it has that section there. This enchantment deals 1 damage to each opponent. Bonus points if you know what card this is. It's a pretty well-known card though, so but you can see that structure, right? Whenever, trigger condition, effect. Now, um, triggered abilities aren't always worded uh in this exact format. There are special kinds of triggered abilities called delayed triggered abilities. So this is another bonus points if you know what card this is. This one's a little bit less well known. But so you can
It
see that,
shouldn't be.
right? It's a very
People
good
should play
card.
this card all over the
Yeah.
place. It does so much more than what it says it does. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Um, so this is I'll print it on an activated ability, right? You can see it has mana cost, colon, and then an effect. But when this activated ability resolves, it does two things. The first thing it does is it exiles target creature. The second thing it does is it creates what's called a delayed triggered ability, which is just there. It just creates an effect that sort of hangs out and waits until its trigger condition is met, and then it triggers exactly once to do its thing. But you can still see the makings of a triggered ability in this sentence, right? So we have at in the middle, a trigger condition, the beginning of the next end step, and in effect, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So when you activate this ability, when you activate the whole ability, right, you'll exile target creature, and then at the beginning of the next end step, there will be a triggered ability that goes on the stack. And when that triggered ability resolves, you'll return the creature that you exiled to the battlefield under its owner's control. All right. So I hope that makes sense.
We have some
Eh,
clarifications in chat. Like the next time you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it.
yes, that would be that would be an example of a trigger, like a delayed trigger. I think I would need to confirm with an example. But yes, essentially, like when you next cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy it would be an example of when its trigger condition, you next cast an instant or sorcery, and then its effect, copy it. Right. Now, a weird thing about triggered abilities is a triggered ability triggers as soon as its trigger conditions are met. But we know we can't put stuff on the stack during the middle of the resolution of a spell, ability, or special action being performed. So this can be kind of hard to keep track of because they just kind of hang out in limbo for a little while. So I find it's helpful to envision there's a triggered ability fairy that watches over every game of Magic you play, and she has this little whiteboard upon which she writes triggered abilities that have triggered, but have not yet been put on the stack. And then, at the appropriate time, she moves those triggered abilities from her whiteboard to the stack where they can wait to resolve. So, everybody say, "Thank you, triggered ability fairy."
Thank you, Triggered Ability Fairy.
All right. So, let's look at this in practice, right? Um, so say I control Lore Scale Coatl. This is a creature that has a triggered ability. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lore Scale Coatl. So you can see it has whenever its trigger condition, you draw a card, and then in effect, put a +1/+1 counter on Lore Scale Coatl. If I were to cast Brainstorm, for example, Brainstorm is an instant that says draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library, right? Every time as I'm resolving Brainstorm, every card I draw will trigger Lore Scale Coatl, and the triggered ability fairy will put that trigger on her whiteboard, where they will wait to be put on the stack until after I have finished resolving Brainstorm by putting 2 cards from my hand on top of my library. So after we finish resolving Brainstorm, but before I get priority, the triggered ability fairy will move those triggers onto the stack in any order I choose. And assuming nobody wants to respond, those triggers will each resolve individually. Now, to see what abilities should trigger, the triggered ability fairy checks the game state immediately after an event occurs. A really clear example of this is with enters triggered abilities. So take Elvish Visionary here, for example. It's a creature with a trigger when Elvish Visionary enters the battlefield, draw a card. So you say you cast Elvish Visionary, nobody has any responses. Elvish Visionary resolves and it enters the battlefield. Immediately after Elvish Visionary enters the battlefield, the triggered ability fairy does a survey of the board to see if there are any abilities that should have triggered. And in this case, it will see that Elvish Visionary has entered the battlefield since the last time that she checked for triggers. So she will put that triggered ability on the whiteboard. And then immediately before a player gets priority, that trigger would get put on the stack. This interaction, I'm going to take a drink real quick.
Also, Neon Red Gorilla, thank you for following? I don't think I did. Thank you for following.
So, this rule is why creatures see each other if multiple creatures enter at the same time. So, say you have a Soul Warden and a Llanowar Elves enter at the same time. You did a Genesis Wave or a Collected Company or something that puts 2 creatures on the battlefield at the same time. Immediately after those creatures enter, the triggered ability fairy surveys the game state to see if any abilities should trigger. And when she finds Soul Warden, she goes, "Oh, hey, a creature that isn't Soul Warden entered the battlefield since the last time I checked for triggered abilities." So she will put Soul Warden's trigger on the whiteboard, where it will, again, wait to go on the stack we uh, until a player gets priority. This rule is also why legendary creatures still trigger their own enters triggers, even if they die to the legend rule. So take Alfariel, for example. Alfariel has an enters trigger. If you were to play a second Alfariel, immediately after Alfariel enters, the triggered ability fairy does a survey of the game state, sees that Alfariel has entered the battlefield, and will put its trigger on the stack, or on the triggered ability whiteboard. Then, before that ability can get moved to the stack, we have to check to see if any state based actions need to be performed, which is where we perform the legend rule. And we'll see that we have 2 Elfariels, right? Which cannot stand. Even if you choose to put the one that just entered into your graveyard, its triggered ability is already on the whiteboard and it's not coming off, right? So after we check for state based actions, but until we get, but before a player gets priority, that trigger will still get put on the stack, even though the card that triggered it is not on the battlefield anymore. Now, there is one exception to this rule, and it's what the game calls leaves the battlefield triggers. Any triggered ability whose trigger condition is a permanent moving to any other zone from the battlefield looks back in time to see if those abilities should trigger. This exception includes abilities that trigger when a creature dies. For example, Avon Fisher has an ability that triggers when it dies. Or they could be worded when a permanent leaves the battlefield, like with Revelark. Or it could be something different. If you look at the third ability on God Eternal Oketra, which says when God Eternal Oketra dies, we've already covered that one, or is put into exile from the battlefield, right, that specifically put into a zone from the battlefield means that this is a leaves the battlefield trigger. So it checks back in time to see if that ability should trigger. And this kind of makes sense, right? If we so let's back up for a second and look at Avon Fisher. right? If we followed our normal pattern of immediately after an event occurs, let's see if an ability should trigger. Following this normal pattern, Avon Fisher dies and goes to the graveyard. Immediately after it dies, the triggered ability fairy would look at the board state and it wouldn't see that there was an ability that should trigger when Avon Fisher dies because Avon Fisher's not around anymore. So the triggered ability fairy has to look back in time, remember what the board state was immediately before Avon Fisher died, to see if Avon Fisher's ability should trigger after it's dead. So I hope that makes sense. Um, this rule is why creatures like Blood Artist will see other creatures die when a board wipe happens, for example. So immediately after the board wipe resolves and all the creatures are dead, the triggered ability fairy thinks back to what the board state was immediately before all those creatures died to see if there are any effects that should trigger when those creatures died and how many times those abilities should trigger, right? So the triggered ability fairy remembers this board state and goes, two creatures died. We got to trigger Blood Artist's ability twice. Okay. Now, the wording of these abilities is incredibly important. Take Sephiroth's ability, for example, which reads, whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere. This is not a leaves the battlefield trigger because Sephiroth doesn't care where the creature cards came from, only that they end up in the graveyard. So Sephiroth will not trigger its own ability when it dies. Its ability will not trigger when a player wipes the board because it is not a leaves the battlefield trigger. So the game will not look back to see if that ability should trigger. Consider instead, as a comparison, um, Sir Conrad, whose triggered ability is incredibly wordy, but does include the phrase whenever another creature dies, which means that this ability is a leaves the battlefield trigger, even though it has other trigger conditions that could cause this ability to trigger. It does look back in time to see if in the event of a board wipe, the triggered ability fairy will look back in time to see how many times Sir Conrad should trigger from creatures dying. All right. So again, if you guys have any questions about triggered abilities or anything else we've talked about, please put those questions in the use that redemption to put those questions in the chat. Um, I some of this stuff can be really confusing, and I would rather address that now instead of later, right? If it would be helpful for you to understand these concepts. Okay. So I've hinted at this already with how I've worded some of my slides, previous slides, especially the stuff about triggered abilities. But I want to explicitly call it out now, right? The phrase active player gets priority is going to come up a lot in the following slides. And this is shorthand for a series of actions being performed. Okay. So, right before a player gets priority, first, we're going to check for state based actions that need to be performed. And if there are any, all of those actions will be performed simultaneously. So, say, for example, um, you know, there's you have a bunch of creatures with +1/+1 counters on them, and an opponent puts some number of -1/-1 counters on them. The game immediately after that spell resolves will check to see that that some number of creatures have both +1/+1 counters and -1/-1 counters. So as a state-based action, we will remove as many counters as we need for there to only be one type of those counters on it. And all those actions are performed at the same time. So even if multiple creatures have this action happening, it will perform it for all of them at the same time. If if when we check for triggered or check for state-based actions that need to be performed, if there are any that are performed, then we check to see if there are any more state-based actions again. So we'll repeat step one here. Once we get through our check for state-based actions with no state-based actions being performed, then the game will consult the triggered ability fairy to see if there are any abilities on her whiteboard that need to be put on the stack. If there are, then we'll take all of those triggered abilities and put them onto the stack in what we call AppNap order, which is short for active player, non active player order. It means that the active player will put all of their triggered abilities on the stack in any order they choose. Then the next player in turn order will put all of their triggered abilities on the stack in any order they choose, and so on and so forth until all the triggered abilities are put onto the stack. If any triggered abilities are put on the stack this way, then we go back to step one and we check for state based actions again. And we're going to keep doing this little dance of checking for state based actions and putting triggered abilities on the stack until no state based actions are performed and no triggered abilities are put on the stack. After we get through steps 1 and 2 with nothing fun happening, the active player gets priority. And they can then, if they would like to, take an action. Now, I want to note here, now that we've talked about it, this whole rigmarole, this song and dance of checking for state-based actions and performing or putting triggered abilities on the stack happens immediately before any player gets priority ever. Right. So if we get to my main phase, for example, we do the state-based actions, we do the triggered abilities, I get priority. If I have nothing I want to do and I pass priority to my opponent, we will once again check for state-based actions and check for triggered abilities before that player gets priority. Generally, simply passing priority will not cause anything like that to happen. But I do also just really like saying rigmarole. So it's a fun word. It has many syllables. Um, okay, so let's walk through a couple of examples. But I want you to help me out here. All right. So for the sake of this example, I control a Maritime Guard, which is a 1/3 merfolk creature with no abilities, and I control a Merfolk Mistbinder, which is a 2/2 merfolk that gives other merfolk +1/+1, which means then that my Maritime Guard is actually a 2/4. If you, for example, were to cast Sweltering Suns to deal 3 damage to each creature, when the dust settles and we've done all the things we need to do, which creatures will die? So we have option A is just Maritime Guard, option B just the Merfolk Mistbinder, and option C is both of them. So we're gonna get a poll in the chat, yeah?
All right, we're starting it now. There we go.
All right. Just as a reminder, there's no judgment, no penalty for wrong answers. Just get those things in the chat, and I would love to get your feedback on it and see how you're thinking, and then we'll talk through after the poll is done. We'll talk through how this all works.
This is the thing you know, but it might help if you can explain it better. There we go. That's what we're here
Yep.
for.
While we're here, I can look at Alter's question. Um, can you cover delayed triggers and end of turn effects, e.g., sneak attack and Sada of the Infinite? I sure can, Alter, and I've got a slide just for that a little bit later. But we will get there.
So I'll go ahead and reject this for right now. How about that? That way, because we're going to be getting to it later.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, I'll reject that one. Okay, it looks like unanimously we have chosen C.
Wow, y'all are on it. Okay, so yeah, the correct answer is C. Let's talk about why. So, um, after sweltering, you cast Sweltering Suns, and that makes me very sad. As Sweltering Suns resolves, it deals 3 damage to each creature. After Sweltering Suns resolves, we will check for state-based actions, and we'll see that Merfolk Mistbinder has been dealt an amount of damage that is equal to or greater than its toughness, which means Merfolk Mistbinder has to die. And I am sad. Now, since we performed a state-based action, we have to check for state-based actions again. And this time, now that Maritime Guard is not getting +1/+1 from the Merfolk Mistbinder, we see that it has 3 damage and marked on it and 3 toughness. So it will also have to die. And because you murdered my merfolk, I am very, very sad. Now, because we just performed a state-based action, we will, of course, check for state-based actions again. But in this case, the board is empty, so there are no state-based actions to perform. Okay. another one, back to back. So in this one, you control a butcher ghoul, and it has a +1/+1 counter on it. So Butcher Ghoul is a 1/1 creature with Undying. If you're not familiar, Undying is a triggered ability that says when this creature dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Right? Now, in this example, your Butcher Ghoul already has a +1/+1 counter on it, so maybe it's already died and come back, whatever. But importantly, I am still mad about what you did to my Merfolk. So I cast Splendid Agony, which is an instant to put two -1/-1 counters on your Butcher Ghoul, which does reduce its toughness to 0, so your Butcher Ghoul will die. But the question for you is, after Butcher Ghoul dies, will Undying trigger? We got another poll?
We do. I'll go ahead and put it now.
Nice. So, essentially what we're asking is, did the Butcher Ghoul have a +1/+1 counter on it when it died? We don't know. Well, I mean, I know, and you might know too. But this is a weird one. This was one that, when I was first introduced to this concept, I didn't understand, and it took me a while to really understand what was happening. Um, so after we talk about it, we'll go through it. But I'm interested to see your thoughts.
We have a question, a clarifying question about state-based actions. Are they sequential or do they happen all at once?
So all when the game sees that state-based actions need to be performed, they're all state-based actions are performed at the same time, simultaneously.
All right. We have 7 votes for yes and 2 votes for no.
Ooh. All right. Well, so this is a good learning opportunity. The Oh, sorry. We put the -1/-1 counters on it. Will Undying trigger? No, it will not. Um, so let's talk about why. So after Splendid Agony resolves, and we put those two -1/-1 counters on Butcher Ghoul, we'll check to see if there are any state-based actions that would need to be performed, and we see that there are two of them. The first is that Butcher Ghoul has 0 or less toughness, so it needs to die. Second, we see that Butcher Ghoul has both a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter, so there's a state-based action that would remove enough +1/+1 counters and -1/-1 counters such that there aren't at least one of each, right? So in this case, there's a state-based action that would remove the +1/+1 counter and one of the -1/-1 counters. Now, both of these state-based actions are performed at exactly the same time. They're performed simultaneously. However, when Undying is checking to see if it should trigger, it looks to the game state immediately before Butcher Ghoul died. And in the game state immediately before Butcher Ghoul died, it still had one +1/+1 counter and two -1/-1 counters on it. So because immediately before it died, it still had a +1/+1 counter on it, Undying will not trigger, right? Does that make sense? Like, state-based actions are performed simultaneously, and Undying is checking the game state before those state-based actions are performed, right? Yeah, it's a weird one. There's a concept you'll hear a lot when you start getting into the rules about last known information. It's not something we're going to talk about here, but it is relevant for the question. But I think we can explain it with just state-based actions. So, um, again, if you have questions about it, I would love to talk more about that or anything else.